last chapter. It's called the Two Frontiers to Conquer. Right? This is really the first chapter in the book, but it's a good template to end on because it describes sort of like the structure that the book is built around. By the two frontiers to conquer yourself, what I mean is that there are two principles, or there are two key ideas that all aspects to self-mastery really are based on. The first is an internal frontier because it represents challenges that are personal or psychological that have to do with you. And the second is an external frontier because it has to deal with challenges that are social or environmental. They don't really have to do with you, but I mean, you're on the planet, you're here. So you got to find ways to protect yourself from it. All right, so the key concept for the first there's an inside and an outside to conquering yourself. Half of it is mastering yourself. The other half is making sure that you don't let the cat's poison you, don't let stuff infect you. So the first half is willpower is an indirect game. That's the key concept. Willpower is an indirect game. The second half is there's a subtle conspiracy against self-discipline. So, you know, you look at like the United States Congress, like is a Senate and a House. So they operate differently and they got different rules and regulations, but they all serve the same nation. To conquer yourself, you need a Senate and a House. You need like rules and regulations for yourself, then you need rules and regulations for the environment. And the book is either based on one of those two poles, usually a combination of two, a combination of both. So when I say willpower is an indirect game, what I mean is that everything that has to do with building your productivity, being more motivated, developing systems, cultivating willpower, what you have to do to get it, what you have to do to build it is usually counterintuitive. It's not obvious or straightforward. Willpower is an indirect game because if you think about it, human behavior as a whole, it's largely governed by like subconscious processes, emotions, instinctual drives, conditioning, stuff we're not usually consciously aware of. A lot of times, anytime you try to force or coerce motivation or willpower out of yourself, you're really doomed to failure. It's like a New Year's resolution because you're working at the surface level. If you think about like psychology, if you think about like neuroscience, if you think about like behavioral dynamics on a deeper level, you'll begin to get insights about how to conquer yourself or how to master yourselves that run counter to just plain old Victorian force. So, for example, I have a technique in there, it's called broadcast your commitments. What I mean by broadcast your commitments is like, if you write a book, tell like 2,000 people that you're going to write a book and this is going to be the date. Or if you're going to do a screenplay, tell everyone you possibly can that you're going to do a screenplay and this is going to be the date. And then set an event for it and publicize that. Because we humans, we protect our social image better than a comic book superhero protects their secret identity. Nobody, like, if it's just us, we'll fall back, we'll slip. But if it's our social image in the like sphere, we'll be more determined to protect that. It's just human. It doesn't sound that glorious. It sounds kind of like whack, like damn, I really gotta depend on. But it works. You get what I'm saying? So like you gotta think to yourself, like, if I set it up, what kind of conditions can I set up to make something inevitable? Because what is it? The fear of embarrassment. There's a book. It's called The Dragons of Eden: Speculations on the Origin of Human Intelligence by Carl Sagan. And what he talks about is how that we humans, we really have three brains. I'm not going to get, it's in the book, it's like a long concept. But we think of ourselves as logical creatures. But the logical aspect of our brain evolved much later in the Homo sapien evolutionary past. We have a logical brain that's in our neocortex. Then we have an emotional brain that's in something called the limbic system. And then we have a physical brain that's in something called the basal ganglia, or reptilian brain. So willpower and logic, the stuff you use to set goals and say, this is what I should do, that's in your neocortex. That's up here. But the stuff that feels down, the stuff that makes you go like, dang, I really don't want to do this, I'm not that motivated, I'm not that hot anyway, that's in your emotional conditioning, which is really mammalian, not human. And like a lot of stuff that relates to like territorial behavior or sexual behavior, that's physical, that's reptilian. So the reality is that because our logic developed last, the stuff we use to set goals has the least influence, it has the least power over our actual behavior. And the stuff that governs, like let's say our emotional conditioning, especially with food and stuff like that, that's much, much more powerful because it has a bigger root. Like I explained it in the book. It's like pretty interesting. But just remember, we humans have 3 brains. You can think of it as having a brain for the mind, having a brain for the heart, and having a brain for the body. But the body and the heart have much more power. So until you learn to align them, until you think about ways to bring it all together, willpower will always elude you. You'll always be at conflict with yourself. So that's willpower as an indirect game. For instance, if you want to eat better, take all the sweets and snacks, put them way high in the cabinet, put them in a place like so difficult to reach that you might forget about it, or you might not want to go through the effort to get it. Whereas stuff like healthy nuts and fruits and stuff, leave that out on the table. Because we unconsciously reach for the most, when we're hungry, we just reach for whatever's there. So try to set up the environment so that there's impediments to what you more likely reach for. You get it? Willpower is an indirect game. Human behavior is determined by factors we rarely consciously think about. And lastly, the subtle conspiracy against self-discipline. So now we're moving over to the external frontier. Essentially, society is structured in a way that, like, if you're trying to discipline yourself, if you're trying to be on point, like, you might as well, like, forget about it. Because everything, once you step outside this room, everything you interact with is designed to either separate you from your money or make you feel less empowered or less in control. Because the less self-discipline you have, the better sheep you are. So if you think about news media, not to say you shouldn't watch the news, but it's like, it's focused on fear. Because people who are like fearful are much more receptive to being told what to do. When you're anxious, when you're afraid, you look for a leader. All right? If you think about like just commercialism in general, we're big consumers in this society. You walk up Midtown, there's just ads everywhere. So people who feel like they need to buy commercial products to fulfill themselves, they're much less likely to find fulfillment through accomplishment at work. Really, self-esteem comes from accomplishment. If you want to feel good about yourself, like do something that only you can do, and nobody will be able to touch that. You know what I mean? So like, or lastly, so there's I call it the conspiracy of, there's a lot of them. There's a conspiracy of distraction, which relates to technology. Ironically, we think technology makes us more productive, but in a funny way, it makes us less productive because we're always distracted. You can't be productive. In Chapter 5, I talk about productivity. You can't be productive if you're always checking updates, if you're always being notified, if you're always being distracted. If people always have access to you, you're not going to be productive. So because of technology, we live in a culture of like constant distraction, which like destroys our ability to concentrate, it destroys our ability to focus, it destroys our ability to get long-term results. Because of consumerism, we live in a culture of surface-level thinking. So a lot of times when we want an emotion, we think if we want to be like sophisticated, we got to buy expensive glasses. If we want to be cool, we got to buy flashy clothes. If we want to be happy, we got to, if we want to have good times, we got to go to an expensive restaurant. So a lot of ways we try to get fulfilled through things that are really just commercial manipulations of our own psyche. So you have to learn to detach yourself from that. So remember, it's one about fear, one about consumerism, one about technology. And that's the subtle conspiracy against self-discipline. Like, you just have to be aware of the fact that 90% of the things that are out there are actually, I'm not saying like a conspiracy like, Alex Jones totalitarian state conspiracy. I'm just saying like the way the world is, if you really analyze it, there's a subtle conspiracy against self-discipline. And the more aware you are of it, the more likely you are to like set up structures so that you can inhibit it from affecting you. So that's essentially it. How to conquer yourself, right? Knowing yourself is intelligence. Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true power. Conquering others is strength. Conquering yourself is true wisdom. All right. Overcome procrastination by disconnecting your accomplishments from your sense of identity, by having a sense of self-worth independent of what you're able to perform or what you're able to obtain. Build motivation by building it internally, by thinking about what your life purpose is, by thinking about what your talents and strengths are, by thinking about what your values are and your principles are, almost like a samurai. Like they had something called samurai code back in the day. So try to develop your own samurai code and try to develop routines and goals that orient around that. Because the more your life is like that, the more you'll just be motivated and empowered as an offset of just that type of activity or that type of psychology. And then lastly, there are 2 frontiers to conquer. There's an internal frontier that has to do with you personally, that you got to get under wraps, and then there's a social frontier that has to do with the environment. So willpower is an indirect game. Build willpower by those counterintuitive indirect methods. Try to be a bit of like a psychologist. Try to think about like what's really determining your behavior on like an instinctual level or an emotional level, rather than a physical one or a direct one. Be like a computer. Like get the source code to the website. Don't just look at the website. You ain't go build a website putting pictures up. You got to know the source code. You got to know HTML. So there's an HTML to your own unconscious. Right? And there's a subtle conspiracy against self-discipline. If you're trying to build discipline, you got to be counter. You got to be anti to what the world is trying to push you to be. And that's essentially it for right now. My friend is shooting a video of this right now. So over there I have a listserv. If you want to get a video of this just to like, you know what I mean, fresh up and whatnot, I'm going to put it on YouTube, so I'll shoot the video to you. And I guess other than that, the book is called How to Conquer Yourself. If you want it, I'll sign it, do a dedication, whatever you want in there, I'll put it in there. You want to get it for your son, your daughter, your best friend, whatever. And we should do Q&A right about now.
Any questions for Brian?
Yeah.